Hello, and welcome to Bracewell's Data Center Counsel Podcast. From energy and utilities to siting and financing, our attorneys cover the opportunities and issues with data center development.
Hello, my name is Jared Berg, and I'd like to welcome you to the Data Center Counsel Podcast. Today, I'm with Bryan Clark, and Bryan and I will be talking about a bit of a market overlay in Texas, give you a little bit of a recent history lesson on how the Texas interconnection queue on the large load side has gotten to be so long, and give you some sense of where we think things are going and how some of our clients and other participants in the industry are solving some of those problems. And then our next episode, we'll dive into a little bit more about the regulatory overlay and the backdrop for what's going on and changes that are being enacted that are going to address some of these issues, or at the very least that we hope will address some of these issues that we're seeing right now. So with that, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Jared Berg. I am a partner in our corporate and securities and energy projects group and one of the leaders of our digital infrastructure and data center development team here at Bracewell that we put together. Bryan Clark is here with me. Bryan, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Jared. My name is Bryan Clark. I am a partner in the energy projects group working out of Bracewell's Dallas office. I have been with the firm for approximately a year, and I joined Bracewell from Pioneer Natural Resources, where I had spent 13 years as Associate General Counsel responsible for midstream and downstream marketing activities, as well as infrastructure projects, including working with our power supply group to obtain electrical supply from various utilities serving the Permian Basin through both purchase agreements and developing projects to support Pioneer's drilling operations.
Yeah, so Bryan and I actually have worked quite closely together over the years, mainly when we were developing a wind farm that delivered energy behind the meter to some of Pioneer's assets, as well as their gas processing partners, gas processing facilities. So we have a long history together. But I guess to kick us off today, Bryan, I thought that it'd be interesting to get a little bit of a background in history on how we got to where we are today. I think that it's relatively well known that interconnection queues, if you have a large load in Texas, expected interconnection times are extending into 2029, 2030 if you haven't already been in the queue for a couple of years. And for those who have, it's still, 3-4 years out. And for those of our listeners who may be wondering why we were going to talk about the oil and gas industry first before diving into what's happening with data centers, I think that it's important to understand that one of the largest sources of electric load in Texas is actually sourced from the oil and gas industry, because as they have pushed to electrify their operations, their electrical load obviously has increased. So Bryan, maybe you can give us a little bit of context going back to the ERCOT study that was conducted and why these new 745 kV lines were ultimately commissioned by ERCOT and the PUCT, and how we started, where we started, and how we got to where we are now.
Yes, absolutely. This story, so to speak, begins in probably 2012, 2013 in the Permian Basin. It was with the advent of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, growth picked up exponentially in that time period. And a lot of the times, the oil and gas industry in West Texas had traditionally relied upon electric utilities to provide well site power for both, primarily for artificial lift, basically the pump jacks that you see across the surface in West Texas, as well as for other activities. But with the exponential growth of the shale industry in West Texas, it became increasingly difficult to get distribution connections. And so a number of producers, including Pioneer, began meeting with the utilities in West Texas and also with the PUCT to basically streamline the distribution connections. And this process took 3 or 4 years, basically, for the end and through several downturns for the oil and gas industry, as well as the electric utility industry, to understand each other's needs to make sure that things were going in an appropriate amount of speed and time to get these connections. But as you began having more oil and gas activities connected to the grid, it was natural supply and demand. It was taking longer. There was more demand for the oil and gas industry for electricity. And it was primarily because it was cheaper to be connected to electric power. Electric-driven engines are more efficient than diesel-driven engines. And during this time and place, there was a emphasis on ESG, and oil and gas industries, like many other industries, are trying to reduce their emissions.
So, Bryan, what I'm hearing from you is effectively it was not only cheaper for the oil and gas industry to move towards electrified operations, but it also satisfied a number of other goals beyond, including ESG, which maybe is less of a focus nowadays. And nowadays, maybe it's more driven by cost efficiency.
Yes. And it was, as you said, it was cost efficiency, and the parties were seeking to increase their margins by reducing their costs. So as the oil and gas industry became increasingly dependent upon electric utilities, there was more and more demand for electricity. And working with various industry groups, including the Texas Oil and Gas Association, TXOGA, we went to the legislature and laid out how the oil and gas industry needed the electric utility industry for continued growth in the Permian Basin. This led primarily to House Bill 5066, which was passed in, I believe it was the 2021 legislative session, which instructed the PUCT to study the Permian Basin and its electric needs. And working with various producers, including Pioneer and others, S&P conducted a study in 2022 to determine the electrical needs in West Texas. And using this as a basis, the PUCT essentially sanctioned 3 high voltage transmission lines to be built from essentially the I-35 corridor into West Texas that would support the oil and gas industry.
But those lines still aren't going to be built for several years, right? Somewhere around 2030 is when the first of them will be commissioned. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. It takes a significant amount of time from essentially the approval process to those lines being energized, simply because the length of the transmission lines that they cover, as well as the materials, staging, so on and so forth.
Right. So basically, if I'm getting this right, Bryan, what we've seen is the oil and gas industry, as they continued to really accelerated their efforts to electrify their operations, they were seeing longer and longer interconnection times. And so one of the proposed solutions to address those interconnection times was by building out additional transmission capacity from East Texas and Central Texas to West Texas to bring additional generation capacity over. So I guess as part of that was the issue with why interconnection times were taking so long. Was it congestion? Was it the availability of generation throughout the state? What was driving that?
It was just the lack of transmission capacity in West Texas.
So by bringing the generation from Central and East Texas over, creating those additional electricity highways, for lack of a better term, that relieves some of the issues in West Texas and allows for faster interconnection times.
It's projected to do so.
Right.
But at the same time, there was also a question of generation. The way the Texas market is set up is that you have various resources, and it bids into what's called an energy-only market, as opposed to other organized markets across the country like PJM or CAISO or SPP, things like that. These markets have what are called capacity markets, in which the ISOs themselves bid out for ancillary services, essentially generation kept in reserve. They pay them just to be available, not necessarily to dispatch, but just to be available. And that has an impact of raising electricity costs for everyone, simply because you're paying for something that you may or may not use. In Texas is what's known in ERCOT is what's known as an energy-only market. meaning that supply and demand match each other at a market clearing price. Now, what's happened over the past several years is there's been a proliferation of first wind and now solar to dispatch into the Texas market. And a lot of the times they set the market clearing price, which can be quite low at some points, zero or even less than zero. And because of the amount of wind and lack of demand. So what this ended up doing is there were a number of developers who didn't want to build dispatchable or a fossil fuel driven generation because they would either not recoup the amount of money that they need for an investment or frankly may lose money. And so at the same time that you had House Bill 5066 studying the market, you also had the establishment of the Texas Energy Fund, which would provide low interest rate loans for the building of dispatchable generation. And after a little bit of a rocky start for the Texas Energy Fund, there have been a number of parties who have now qualified and are building or will build in the near future new dispatchable generation within Texas.
In the meantime, though, we still have, a massive industry in oil and gas, and we'll certainly be getting to the data center influx of interconnection applications here momentarily. But to kind of finish out the story here, what is it that companies are doing in the oil and gas industry? They have to continue operating. They still have to produce. They have, commitments that they've made, or, in general, they have to generate revenue. So how is it that the oil and gas industry is continuing to operate? Are they just sticking by their old diesel generators, or are they continuing to electrify? And I know that we've seen some other solutions, but in your experience, how are you seeing these companies address the long interconnection times that are taken for once they apply?
Primarily, they are trying to be sophisticated by working with the utilities to try to get interconnections, primarily at the distribution level, but some at transmission levels, on a timely time frame. But at the same time, recognizing that they have drill schedules, that they have commitments that they need to make, and so on and so forth. What they're doing is relying upon primarily gas-fired mobile generation, in which essentially you have a provider come out and on a flatbed semi or several flatbed semis, they come out and they provide localized generation, essentially behind the meter, but it's specifically mobile generation to be used for a set period of time or until the utility can connect in that area. And you're also seeing installation of modular generation as well. Not necessarily mobile generation, but sort of that in-between step between a large gas-fired generator and mobile generator. So it's a way to provide localized power on essentially a temporary basis, temporary being potentially 2 or 3 years.
That's right. So now to kind of bring all this home, we've talked about how we've come from an environment where the oil and gas industry in Texas really was kind of the main driver of load growth. Whether that was electrifying their oil field operations, artificial lift, or gas processing plants going online because of an influx of natural gas in the Permian Basin in particular. And haven't even touched associated gas, but maybe we can talk about that here in a minute. But and so with the oil and gas industry experiencing slower interconnection times, one of the solutions that was proposed was, and is now being implemented, is delivering additional transmission capacity by building out 745 kV lines from East Texas to West Texas. Then there's this influx of data centers that is hit the state. And I think I've heard estimates of upwards of 180 gigawatts of additional load interconnection applications. And Bryan is pointing his thumb upwards. It's even higher than that, of new large load interconnection applications in Texas. And the vast majority of that is attributable to new data centers that are being planned. Now, I think that a lot of what we've seen is that many of those data centers are prospective. They don't necessarily have committed tenants yet. And maybe they've acquired some land or an option to acquire land, and then they've submitted an interconnection application, but they don't necessarily have all of the backing and everything ready. But then they go and announce that project. And the whole idea there is to attract tenants. And in order to build the project, you have to have your anchor tenant because that's how you finance the whole thing, right? So I'm curious if data centers are running into the same issues that the oil and gas industry is when they submit an interconnection application in Texas. Are they seeing the same timelines in the interconnection queue that the oil and gas industry is seeing? And what is that resulting in, Bryan?
The short answer to your question is yes. The longer answer is, like a lot of things, multifaceted and has a different perspective depending upon where you sit. Coming from the oil and gas industry, I look at the data center industry with just a little bit of admiration and a little bit of jealousy. Oil and gas producers worked with the PUCT, worked with ERCOT, worked with utility for 10 years to get to a point where there was a level of trust and a level of education from both sides to get to a workable solution so that the oil and gas industry could electrify on a consistent basis moving forward. But around 2022, 2023, right as essentially that decades-long effort was coming to fruition, data centers just essentially jumped into center stage in this process. And I think it's primarily a matter of regulatory certainty, economics, business environment, so on and so forth, that you started to have, and just the nature of Texas sitting geographically in the center of the United States with several fiber optic cables that crisscross the state, making it availability for data centers to connect into to provide their information to the country and in some instances the world. So you had a confluence of events that made Texas starting to become ground zero for data center development. This really started coming to a head in 2023, 2024, that you had the oil and gas industry and other large industries in Texas, primarily like semiconductor construction and manufacturing and other industries that use significant amount of electricity, a large load, which is defined as greater than 75 megawatts, located at one specific area. And you had several of these interconnection requests starting to come into the various utilities across the state. And so what you started to see in information published by ERCOT is that the large load interconnection queue was starting to grow. ERCOT, to its credit, started seeing this in 2022 and came up with an interim process for large load interconnections. Coming from the oil and gas industry, a lot of that had to deal with the oil and gas industry, because with the use of fracturation facilities for oil and gas development of horizontal wells, they use a significant amount of electricity. Natural gas processing plants, they use significant amounts, over 100 megawatts. And so there was a number of these essentially submitting interconnection requests at ERCOT. And so ERCOT started developing on an interim basis a framework for large load interconnections. Now, as an energy-only market, what ERCOT essentially does, in a simple analogy, is they don't manage the highway. They don't manage the transmission network. They provide the on-ramp to that transmission network, and then it's the market that manages the network, primarily through congestion charges or congestion fees, because if a congestion fee is essentially, in a simple term, if there is one point and then another point in which there's a high amount of usage, the market through congestion charges more to move electricity over a certain path. That way, somebody who has a firm pathway, who is willing to pay more for that firm pathway, will receive service, while somebody who may see themselves as an intermittent user may essentially dial down its demand of electricity. That's in simple terms, but ERCOT relies upon the market to manage the network. So what you started to see is a number of these interconnection requests were starting to come forward. ERCOT took its time to develop what was then going to be known as a large load interconnection protocol through the planning guide resources of the ERCOT protocols to manage how these large loads were going to connect. At the same time, because of the proliferation of large load interconnections, you had the Texas legislature in 2025 pass which was known as SB 6, which was again to manage these large load interconnection requests through things like standardization and cost sharing, net metering arrangements for co-located facilities, curtailment of large loads, and creation of a new demand response program, all throughout on SB 6, which is currently going through the rulemaking process at the PUCT on how they're going to implement this legislation.
Yeah.
It's just that data centers, because of earlier, the confluence of circumstances in Texas, had to find a way to efficiently manage the system to make sure that eventually whoever wanted to be connected could be connected to the grid.
So maybe if I can summarize kind of what you were saying, and I know that in our next episode, we'll be getting into more detail about what's going on, what Senate Bill 6 exactly is accomplishing, and then maybe some other updates that are happening in the large load interconnection queue process right now. But just to kind of summarize, from the data center standpoint right now, the status quo effectively is they're facing the same interconnection delays or, large load interconnection delays that the oil and gas industry is facing. And so
any large
load, frankly.
Yes.
Yeah. So that could include large manufacturing facilities as well, right?
Yes.
So what they're facing are these delays. They file an interconnection request and they are told, okay, great, we'll see you in 2029 or what have you, 2030, before you can get your 200 megawatts online. So in the interim, and you and I have worked on a number of these projects, but in the interim, data centers are trying, and large load developers in general are kind of going to the same solutions, right? Mobile, on-site, co-located generation. And one of the things that you were mentioning earlier, Bryan, and maybe we'll hit on here as the last point, is part of Senate Bill 6 is, curtailment rights that ERCOT would have over large loads. So to translate that into English, basically, ERCOT would have the ability to shut down or reduce the amount of electricity that is going to some of these large loads in the event that there's a grid emergency. So, for example, like a winter storm Uri situation where there's not enough generation because the cold has shut down all the gas pipelines. There's not enough generation available to satisfy load for one reason or another. I guess at the end of the day, to your point, Bryan, everybody who has a large load that is looking to get power in the short term is having to turn to finding their own generation solutions. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I think that's probably a good place to stop on this first episode. Thanks everybody for joining us today on the Data Center Counsel Podcast. On our next episode, we'll be talking a little bit more about the regulatory overlay. We'll dive into some of the stuff that Bryan was mentioning with respect to Senate Bill 6 and why that's also creating additional influence towards mobile generation or on-site generation. And then we'll also talk a little bit about some updates that we're hearing rumblings about for the interconnection process. So again, thanks everybody for joining us. This was an episode of Data Center Counsel. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Bracewell's Data Center Counsel Podcast. To contact any of today's guests, please reach out to datacentercounsel@bracewell.com.